New York City glowed softly beneath the night sky, a patchwork of lights stretching to the horizon, as if the stars themselves had descended to rest on the streets. The hum of traffic was distant, muted, as if the city were holding its breath. Somewhere in this vast metropolis, in a quiet home away from the chaos, lived a man who had more power than almost anyone walking those streets, and yet, if you passed him in daylight, you might never notice him. FBI, with its wiretaps and raids, could not drag him into a courtroom for long. He walked free time and again, as if charmed. But his story is not only about winning, it's about how he managed to do it without letting ego destroy him. His story feels less like a violent crime saga and more like a game of chess played in silence, where every move is deliberate and every victory is quiet. As we move deeper into this story, we will see where Carlo Gambino came from, how he survived the brutal mafia wars of the 1920s and how he stepped into power when the moment was right. And the clothes on their backs. The air below deck was thick and immigrants from Sicily and southern Italy faced prejudice and suspicion. Many settled in tight-knit neighborhoods where they could speak their own language and rely on one another for work and protection. For Carlo, Brooklyn would become this new home, a place where he could blend into the crowd yet quietly seek opportunity. In these early days, Carlo did not immediately leap into crime. Like many young men, he worked where he could, sometimes on the docks, sometimes in small trades. But his sharp mind and natural talent for discretion made him attractive to the older men who already had connections through his Sicilian countrymen. This was a chance to quietly step into the shadows and begin building the life he envisioned. His early crimes were small, hijackings, liquor smuggling, and protection rackets, but they were carefully chosen. He did not act rashly or greedily. While other young men might have boasted about their exploits, Carlo kept silent. If police questioned him, he gave little away, often walking free with a polite nod and a blank expression. This habit of never letting anyone see him sweat would become. By the mid-1920s, Carlo had firmly established himself as a reliable soldier in the mafia ranks. He was no longer just an immigrant boy trying to survive, he was part of an organization that was rapidly growing in power and wealth. And yet, he remained almost invisible to the public eye. There were no headlines screaming his name, no sensational trials. He simply kept moving forward, one quiet step at a time. But a storm was coming, one that would sweep through the entire underworld and leave many of Carlo's contemporaries dead or in prison. The Castellammare War was about to erupt, a violent power struggle between the old guard bosses and the ambitious newcomers who wanted to reshape the mafia for a new era. Carlo Gambino would find himself in the middle of it, and how he chose to act would determine the course of his future. As we leave this chapter, imagine Carlo walking home through the streets of Brooklyn at night, the distant sound of gunfire echoing somewhere far off. His face is calm, unreadable, but inside, he is already planning for what is to come. The underworld is shifting, and he intends not just to survive the coming war but to emerge stronger than ever. The late 1920s brought a heavy tension over New York's Italian neighborhoods, like a storm cloud that would not move. The mafia, still loosely organized at the time, was splitting into two factions that could not coexist. On one side was Joe the Boss Masseria, an old-school leader who believed in ruling by brute force and fear. On the other was Salvatore Marangiano, a man from Castellammare del Golfo who dreamed of reshaping the mafia into a disciplined, structured society. The coming clash would not just be a fight over territory, it would be a war for the soul of organized crime. Carlo Gambino, still a young but quietly rising figure, found himself watching as the streets began to smolder with conflict. Murders became common, ambushes happening in broad daylight, and whispers of betrayal were everywhere. The Castellammare War, as it would come to be known, was unlike anything the city had seen before. This was not a brief flare of gang violence, but a drawn-out campaign that would claim dozens of lives and permanently alter the underworld. Imagine Brooklyn at this time, the gas lamps casting long shadows, the sound of footsteps echoing too loudly in empty alleys, the way men looked over their shoulders before entering a cafe. The atmosphere was charged, electric with paranoia. A single wrong move, a careless word to the wrong ear, could end in a bullet to the back of the head. Gambino, ever the student of survival, chose his side carefully. His Sicilian roots drew him toward Marangino's faction, and it was here that his quiet loyalty would begin to pay dividends. The Castellammare faction valued discipline and discretion, qualities Carlo had been cultivating all his life. While others sought glory in the war, Gambino stayed calm, doing what was asked of him and no more. The war stretched on for years, each assassination leading to another in a grim cycle. Newspapers of the time reported a steady stream of gangland killings, often without naming suspects. The public might see the violence as random, but in the underworld, every death had meaning. It was chess played with real lives, and Carlo Gambino was learning to think several moves ahead. During these years, Gambino forged alliances that would last a lifetime. He worked alongside men who would become legendary, future bosses, underbosses, and consiglieri. These were the years when Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello were also rising through the ranks, each man quietly shaping his future. Gambino observed them closely, noting their methods, their mistakes, and the way they handled power. At the height of the war, Carlo's life was constantly at risk. Being associated with one side meant you were a target for the other. He had to keep moving, staying alert, never allowing himself to be predictable. Friends could become enemies overnight, and even trusted allies could be turned for the right price. But Gambino's greatest weapon was his invisibility. He was not a headline name, not a brash gunman known for loud crimes. He was the man in the background, steady and dependable, carrying out orders with quiet precision. The turning point came in 1931, when Lucky Luciano orchestrated the murder of Joe Masseria, effectively ending the war. Marangino emerged victorious, taking the title of Boss of Bosses. For a brief moment, it seemed peace had been restored. But even as Marangino celebrated his victory, Carlo Gambino remained cautious. He knew that power gained through violence was never secure for long. Luciano and his allies soon turned on Marangino, orchestrating his assassination as well. The old system of a single boss of bosses was abolished, replaced with a new governing body, the Commission, which gave each major crime family a seat at the table. It was the beginning of the modern American mafia. For Gambino, this was a moment of opportunity. Men like that were invaluable. The 1930s were a time of rebuilding for the mafia. Bootlegging was still profitable, but with prohibitions and approaching, the families began to diversify their income streams. Gambling, extortion, loan sharking, labor racketeering, all of these became major revenue sources. Gambino. By the end of the 1930s, Carlo Gambino was no longer just a soldier, he was a trusted figure within the Mangano family, with a power base that was growing every year. The commission system had given him a stable platform on which to build, and he was quietly preparing for the day when lifestyle continued to be one of his greatest shields. While some capos flaunted wealth with flashy suits and expensive cars, Gambino still dressed simply and lived quietly. He spent time with his wife and children, attended church regularly, and kept up appearances as a respectable man. This facade made it harder for law enforcement to pin him as a dangerous criminal mastermind. Neighbors might have suspected he was connected, but they saw a collision. Vincent Mangano had grown suspicious of Anastasia's power and accused him of plotting behind his back. Anastasia, in turn, believed Mangano was trying to push him out. The air was thick with paranoia, and everyone knew that when bosses turned on each other, blood was sure to follow. Then, in April of 1951, the storm finally broke. Vincent Mangano disappeared. His body was never officially found. His brother, Philip Mangano, was discovered shortly after, shot to death near a marsh in Brooklyn. The message was clear: Albert Anastasia had made his move. With the Mangano brothers gone, Anastasia stepped forward to take control of the family. The underworld reacted with a mixture of shock and inevitability. Few doubted that Anastasia had been behind the killings. He kept his crew disciplined and profitable, so that when the time came, no one could say he hadn't earned his place at the table. Picture Gambino during these years, sitting silently in a corner of a smoky backroom, listening as Anastasia's booming voice filled. He treated his men fairly, paid them well, and made sure they knew he would protect them when necessary. This created a level of devotion that went beyond money. In a world where betrayal was always a possibility, Carlo built a foundation of trust that would later secure his smooth rise to power. Imagine Gambino during this period, quiet. The autumn of 1957 was charged with tension, as if the entire underworld was holding its breath. For years, Albert Anastasia had ruled the family with iron fists and quick tempers, but his reign had grown increasingly unstable. His enemies on the commission whispered that he had become reckless, that his killings were too bold, too public, bringing too much heat on everyone. The balance of power Luciano had once carefully built was cracking. Carlo Gambino, as always, remained calm and in the background, but the quiet gears of his mind were turning. He had waited patiently, slowly strengthening his crew, his alliances, and his influence. Now, the moment he had been preparing for had finally arrived. The other bosses were ready to act. Anastasia had become too dangerous to leave alive. A decision was made: he had to go. The plan that unfolded was precise, clinical, the kind of work Gambino appreciated. On the morning of 25th October 1957, Anastasia entered the Park Sherto Hotel in Manhattan for his usual routine. He liked just a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that the family now had a new boss. The Mangano crime family was no more. From that day forward, it would be known as the Gambino family. For Gambino, this was the culmination of decades of patience. He had risen from an immigrant boy fresh off the boat to the head of the most powerful crime family in New York. And he had done. Imagine the difference this made in Brooklyn. The streets felt less tense, the docks ran smoothly, and gamblers and bookmakers could work without fearing sudden reprisals. For the men under him, this was good news. Their profits were steady, their risks lower, and they no longer had to look over their shoulders every day wondering if they would be ordered into a bloody war. Gambino's approach was almost corporate in nature. He thought of the family as a business empire, one that needed structure, discipline, and careful management. He placed trusted men in key positions, not necessarily the loudest or most feared, but the most reliable. Loyalty and discretion mattered more than muscle. The family's rackets, gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, loan sharking were organized with an eye toward efficiency and minimizing exposure. One of his key strategies was diplomacy. Gambino knew that open wars between families were expensive, dangerous, and destructive. When conflicts arose with other bosses, he preferred to sit down and negotiate. This earned him a reputation as a peacemaker, someone who could diffuse volatile situations before they spiraled out of control. In doing so, he not only protected his own interests, but also elevated his status among the five families. The commission meetings during this was how Gambino ruled, not with noise, but with presence. His power was felt rather than seen, like the stillness before a storm. The men who wanted to make money from it, and if a share of that money flowed back to his coffers, he would not interfere. Picture the scale of this empire, cash flowing in from dice games in Brooklyn, shipping kickbacks from all of it moving upward, quietly, until it reached the calm, watchful man at the center. Gambino did not need to count every dollar himself. He had trusted lieutenants for that, but he made sure the system worked like clockwork. What made his empire unique was not just its profitability, but its stability. Gambino had built something that could run without constant gunfire or dramatic shows of force. His operations were designed to be invisible to the public, to look almost like legitimate. If he suspected a meeting place was compromised, he would change locations. If a phone felt unsafe, he simply stopped using it. Imagine the frustration inside the FBI's New York office during these years, rooms filled with wiretap transcripts that captured nothing but the men on the commission deferred to him. Businessmen knew that a word from Gambino could make or break their contracts. Politicians quietly acknowledged that his control over unions gave him influence over. Forward slightly, his voice calm, almost soft. He lays out a solution, a division of profits that allows both sides to save face. Slowly, the anger fades, the nods of agreement begin, and the room relaxes. Once again, disaster has been averted, not with gunfire but with a quiet word. This ability to keep the peace was not just good for business, it made Gambino indispensable. Even families outside New York respected his leadership. Bread warm from the oven, the sound of plates being set on the table. Carlo sits at the head, not as a feared mob boss, but as the patriarch of his family. He greets his wife, Catherine, with a small smile, asks about the children, and listens as they talk about their day. In these moments, the weight of the criminal empire fades away. Gambino's devotion to his family was one of the most consistent threads in his life. He had 3 sons and a daughter, and he worked hard to keep them shielded from the more dangerous side of his world. He wanted them to grow up educated, disciplined, and safe. The man who ruled the mafia like a patient king also ruled his household with the same calm hand. Even as he aged and his health began to decline, this devotion to home and family never wavered. He continued to gather with his children and grandchildren to offer advice and guidance. Those close planning. Carlo's ability to avoid prison became legendary. Other bosses, men like Joe Colombo and Vito Genovese, found themselves behind bars, their empires weakened by constant legal battles. But Gambino stayed free, year after year. This not only protected him but strengthened his reputation. To his men, It seemed as if their boss was untouchable, a man the law could never pin down. Picture Carlo stepping out of a courthouse after another legal battle. Imagine him during these years, his gait slower, his face lined but still composed, his voice softer yet no less commanding. He still attended meetings, still offered guidance, but he no longer lingered as long. After decades of careful planning and patient maneuvering, Gambino was finally turning his mind toward the question that every leader must face: what happens after I am gone? Heart problems had plagued him for years, and now they became more frequent. His doctors advised him to rest, to avoid stress, but Carlo Gambino's life had never been one where he could simply walk away. The empire he had built was vast, touching every corner of New York's economy, and he could not allow it to fall into chaos. Even as his strength waned, he continued to manage the family's affairs from his modest home, receiving trusted capos in quiet meetings, hearing reports, giving instructions. Those who visited him in these years often remarked on his clarity. Though his body was weaker, his mind remained sharp. He still remembered every name, every alliance, every subtle shift in power among the 5 families. He knew who could be trusted, who might pose a threat, and who had the skill to guide the family after his death. Succession was a delicate matter. Gambino had spent his entire life avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, and he wanted to ensure that the transition of power after his passing would be smooth. He began quietly grooming his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as his successor. Castellano, known for his preference for business and low violence, reflected Carlo's own approach. By choosing him, Gambino hoped to preserve the calm, businesslike order he had built. Not everyone in the family agreed with this choice. Some capos preferred a more street-oriented leader, someone closer to the rank-and-file soldiers. But Gambino did not waver. For him, stability was more important than popularity. He believed that Castellano could keep the family profitable, avoid open wars, and continue the quiet dominance that had defined the Gambino era. Picture Carlo sitting at his kitchen table during one of these succession conversations, his hands folded, his breathing slow. Around him sit a few trusted advisors, the air thick with cigarette smoke. There is no anger in his voice, only a calm certainty. He explains why Castellano is his choice, why this path will protect the family, why it will prevent the kind of bloody power struggles that had destroyed other bosses' legacies. Even as he planned for the future, Gambino never fully withdrew from his role. He still kept close watch on union rackets, gambling operations, and the flow of money. If disputes arose, he made sure they were handled quietly. He was determined that no one should see weakness, that law enforcement should never believe the family was vulnerable. But privately, he began to reflect more on the life he had lived. He had crossed an ocean as a young man with nothing, survived wars, taken power without ever stepping into the spotlight, and ruled longer than any of his contemporaries. Few mob bosses in history had managed to live this long, let alone remain free, wealthy, and in control until the end. His family life continued to be his anchor. Evenings were spent with Catherine and his children, who now had children of their own. Carlo enjoyed watching his grandchildren play, seeing in them the continuation of everything he had worked so hard to protect. In those quiet moments, perhaps, he felt a measure of peace, a sense that the risks, the careful plotting, and the decades of discipline had been worth it. And yet, death was never far from his mind. Friends and rivals alike were dying around him, some from old age, others from bullets. The mafia landscape was changing. Law enforcement had become more aggressive than ever, with RICO prosecutions looming, wiretaps improving, and the government determined to break the mafia's hold on the city. Gambino knew that the next generation would face challenges he could not protect them from forever. In the final months of his life, Carlo spent more time at home, rarely venturing out except when absolutely necessary. The once invisible boss became even more elusive, his public appearances limited to family events and church. His men continued to bring him reports, continued to seek his blessing on important decisions, but it was clear that the transition was underway. Castellano was already stepping into a leadership role, gradually taking on more responsibility. Imagine one of Carlo's last summer evenings, the house quiet, the warm breeze drifting in through open windows. He sits on the porch, perhaps with a light sweater against the chill, looking out at the neighborhood he had called home for decades. Children play somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter faint on the air. The streets he once walked as an ambitious young man are still here, unchanged in some ways, though the man who now sits watching them is very different. Carlo Gambino had lived a life of strategy, of careful moves and patient waiting. Now, as his health declined, he faced the final truth that no man can outwait time. But there was no fear in him, no panic. He had prepared for this moment as carefully as he had prepared for every other turning point in his life. The empire was secure, the future arranged, the family ready. As this chapter closes, picture Carlo rising slowly from his chair, steadying himself with one hand, and walking back into his house. The night has fallen, the streets are quiet, and the quiet dawn, though his body is failing, is still in control, still thinking several moves ahead. Soon, his reign will end, but he will leave behind an empire that bears his name and a legacy that will outlast him. It was a clear October day in 1976 when the final chapter of Carlo Gambino's remarkable life quietly unfolded. He had been in failing health for some time, his heart weakened after years of stress and age, but even in these final weeks he remained composed, dignified, and very much the man who had ruled the underworld with calm precision. There would be no dramatic shootout, no police raid ending in handcuffs, no violent betrayal. The man who had survived the Castellammare War, the fall of bosses, assassination plots, and decades of FBI surveillance would leave this world exactly as he had lived in it, quietly, on his own terms. Picture the morning of 15th October 1976. The Gambino home on Ocean Parkway is calm, bathed in soft autumn light. Leaves rustle gently outside, and the air is cool. Inside, the quiet dawn is preparing for a family gathering to celebrate his grandson's wedding. He dresses carefully, as always, his suit pressed, his tie neat. Those who see him that morning notice that he seems a bit tired, his movements slower than usual, but his presence is still commanding. Even in frailty, Carlo Gambino radiates a kind of quiet authority. Later that day, after enjoying time with his family, Carlo sits in his favorite chair. Perhaps there is a faint smile on his face as he listens to the murmur of conversation in the background. This, after all, is what he fought for: a safe, prosperous family, a life where he could sit in peace and watch the next generation carry on. At some point that evening, surrounded by the warmth of home, Carlo Gambino suffers a heart attack. There is no chaos, no panic. The end comes gently, almost like drifting into sleep. The news spread quickly, first through the family, then through the underworld. For a moment, the mafia world seemed to stop. This was not just the death of a boss, it was the passing of an era. Carlo Gambino had ruled longer than almost any of his contemporaries, and he had done so without the bloody collapses that had claimed so many others. Imagine the scene in the following days. The Gambino home becomes a place of quiet pilgrimage. Friends, relatives, and allies come to pay their respects, speaking in hushed voices. There is no loud display, no spectacle for the newspapers. True to his nature, Gambino's funeral arrangements are modest. He is given a traditional Catholic service, attended by family members, close associates, and even a few rivals who come not out of obligation but out of respect. The church is filled with the smell of incense, the sound of soft prayers, the distant echo of organ music. Men in dark suits sit silently in the pews, their hats in their hands, their faces solemn. Some of them are powerful figures in their own right, bosses, underbosses, consigliere, yet on this day, they are simply mourners. For all his power, Carlo Gambino was known as a man who avoided unnecessary cruelty, a man who brought stability to a world that often thrived on chaos. Outside the church, reporters gather, hoping for a glimpse of the mourners, hoping for a headline. But the ceremony is quiet, the family private, and the cameras are kept at a respectful distance. There are no dramatic scenes, no public outbursts. The quiet Don's farewell is as understated as his life. His burial takes place at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, a place where many figures of organized crime have been laid to rest. The coffin is lowered into the ground under a soft, grey sky. A few final words are spoken, a prayer offered, and then it is done. The man who once held the entire commission together, who controlled industries, unions, and fortunes, is gone. The world moves on, but something feels different, as though a steady hand has been lifted from the scales. For the Gambino family, both his blood relatives and his criminal organization, his death marks the end of an extraordinary reign. Paul Castellano, as Carlo had arranged, steps into the role of boss. The transition is smooth, without the bloodshed that so often follows a mafia leader's death. This was Carlo's last gift to his family, the gift of stability. Even the FBI, who had chased him for decades, acknowledged the significance of his passing. In their reports, there was almost a tone of respect. They had never managed to put him away, never seen him serve a major prison sentence. In the end, Gambino had beaten them in the only way that truly mattered, by living long enough to die free, in his own home, surrounded by the life he had built. Picture, one last time, the quiet house on Ocean Parkway after the funeral. The rooms are still, the air heavy with memory. In the study where Carlo once held meetings, the chair sits empty. The streets outside look the same as they always have, but for those who knew him, they will never feel quite the same again. Carlo Gambino's death was not a dramatic headline or a bloody climax, it was a curtain gently falling on one of the most extraordinary stories in organized crime history. No gunfire, no sirens, no betrayal. Just silence. The man who ruled from the shadows slipped away into them, leaving behind an empire, a family, and a legend that would endure long after the world stopped whispering his name. As this chapter closes, imagine the city at night, the lights of Brooklyn glowing softly, the river dark and calm, the noise of the streets fading into the distance. Somewhere, in the stillness, the memory of Carlo Gambino lingers, not as a shout, but as a whisper. The quiet dawn has left the stage, but his presence can still be felt, like a faint echo, reminding everyone that real power does not roar. It endures. When the news of Carlo Gambino's death spread across New York, the underworld held its breath. For more than 2 decades, Gambino had been the quiet anchor of the five families, the man who kept disputes contained and bloodshed minimal. Now, for the first time in years, there was uncertainty. Who would take his place? Would the transition be smooth, or would it ignite the kind of violent power struggles that had marked the end of other bosses' reigns? But Carlo Gambino had not left this to chance. True to his patient and careful nature, he had spent his final years preparing for this very moment. His choice was clear: Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, would become the next boss. Castellano was known as Big Paul, a tall, imposing figure with a taste for fine suits and expensive living, but also a man who shared Gambino's preference for business over open warfare. This decision was meant to ensure that the Gambino family would remain steady, profitable, and as bloodless as possible. The transition, at least on the surface, was seamless. In quiet meetings held in Brooklyn and Staten Island, the capos were informed of the new order. Castellano took the head seat at the table, his authority backed by the weight of Gambino's dying wish and the support of powerful allies like Tommy Lachi's successors. There were no immediate coups, no shootouts, no riots on the streets. For a moment, it seemed that the Gambino family had achieved what few others had: a peaceful passing of the crown. But beneath that calm surface, trouble was already beginning to simmer. Castellano was a different kind of boss. While Carlo Gambino had lived modestly and maintained a connection to the street-level soldiers, Big Paul preferred the comforts of a mansion on Staten Island, far removed from the day-to-day operations of the rackets. He saw the family less as a gang and more as a corporation, focusing heavily on white-collar crimes, construction kickbacks, and large-scale business deals. For some of the family's more traditional members, this was a problem. They felt disconnected from a boss who rarely came down to meet them face-to-face, who seemed more interested in fine dining than in maintaining the personal touch that Gambino had mastered. Soldiers and capos who had once felt personally valued under Carlo now grumbled quietly about the new boss's style. Still, in the first months after Gambino's death, the family remained stable. Money continued to flow from the docks, from gambling operations, from union rackets. Castellano used his power to expand into new territories, including legitimate meat and poultry distribution businesses, which gave him enormous leverage over supermarkets and restaurants across New York. The profits were immense, and many capos accepted his rule because their pockets stayed full. Imagine one of these early meetings under Castellano's rule: the same smoky backroom, the same men sitting around the table, but the atmosphere slightly different. Big Paul sits at the head, his presence imposing, but the warmth and quiet humility that Carlo brought to these gatherings is gone. Castellano speaks at length, outlining his plans, issuing detailed instructions. The men nod, they agree, but in their eyes there is a flicker of something, perhaps unease, perhaps the first spark of resentment. Outside the family, law enforcement watched closely. They knew that a change at the top often meant instability, and instability meant opportunities to infiltrate. FBI agents intensified their surveillance, bugging Castellano's home, listening to conversations that revealed not just business dealings but the personal habits and weaknesses of the new boss. Unlike Gambino, Castellano sometimes forgot to keep things vague. He trusted technology and private spaces more than Carlo ever had, and that trust would eventually become a liability. Meanwhile, rivals within the family began to take note of the growing gap between Castellano and the street crews. One man, in particular, was waiting patiently. John Gotti, a charismatic and ambitious capo who believed the family needed a more hands-on leader. For now, Gotti stayed quiet, respecting the memory of Gambino and allowing Castellano's rule to solidify. But in the shadows, alliances were being formed, plans quietly whispered. For the moment, though, the Gambino family remained the most powerful of the five families. Its control of the Brooklyn waterfront was unchallenged, its ties to unions strong, its income streams diversified and secure. The commission continued to function, with Castellano taking Carlo's seat, though some bosses noted that he lacked Gambino's calming influence. Where Carlo had been a master mediator, Castellano could be rigid, unwilling to bend when compromise might have served better. Picture the city in those years after Carlo's death, the docks still bustling with activity, trucks rumbling down the streets, bookmakers taking bets in backrooms, envelopes of cash still being passed quietly from hand to hand. To the outside world, little seemed to have changed. But those inside the organization could feel the subtle shift. The era of Gambino's quiet balance was over. Something more volatile was taking shape, though few could predict just how explosive it would eventually become. The FBI, sensing opportunity, intensified their efforts to flip lower-level associates into informants. With Castellano at the helm, they began to gather more usable intelligence than they ever had under Gambino. Slowly, piece by piece, cases were being built. And yet, for a time, Carlo's legacy held strong. His vision of a family that valued profit over pride kept the streets relatively calm, at least compared to the chaos of earlier decades. Castellano's rule may not have been loved by all, but it kept the money flowing, and in the world of organized crime, that was often enough. As this chapter closes, imagine the empty chair in Carlo's study, the man who once sat there now gone but not forgotten. His careful planning had ensured that the empire he built did not collapse the moment he passed. But like all empires, it was vulnerable to change, and change was coming. The next chapter in the Gambino family's history would be louder, bloodier, and far more public. The quiet dawn's shadow still loomed over everything, but the men who now held power would soon have to prove whether they could rule as wisely, or whether the empire would crack under the weight of their ambition. Carlo Gambino's death did not end his story. In many ways, it only deepened it. In the years and decades that followed, his name became more than just a name. It became a symbol, almost a legend, whispered with a mix of respect, awe, and even nostalgia by those who remembered the era he represented. The underworld he once ruled would grow louder, bloodier, and far more chaotic after his passing, but to many, Gambino remained the benchmark, the model of what a true mafia boss should be. Even among law enforcement, there was a grudging respect for the man they could never cage. FBI files from the 1970s described him as the most powerful and disciplined boss in America, someone who had managed to run an empire for decades without ever serving significant time in prison. To prosecutors, this was maddening, but it was also proof of his genius. Gambino had mastered the art of staying just beyond the government's reach, keeping his operations clean enough to avoid conviction, but profitable enough to build an empire. For the men who came after him, Carlo's shadow loomed large. All Castellano tried to emulate his business-first philosophy but lacked his personal touch, his quiet charisma that kept soldiers loyal even when profits were slim. John Gotti, who would eventually overthrow Castellano, represented the opposite of Gambino's style: loud, flamboyant, a media darling who courted attention rather than avoided it. Gotti became a celebrity boss, but his reign ended in handcuffs, his life in a cell. In contrast, Carlo Gambino remained the man who walked away from the game undefeated, dying free in his own home. This contrast has shaped how history remembers him. Gambino's life is often described as the pinnacle of mafia leadership, patient, careful, calculating. He understood that fear might control men for a moment, but respect could control them for a lifetime. He knew that the surest way to survive was not to make yourself a target. In a world filled with violence, he chose subtlety. In a world filled with egos, he chose humility. Imagine the myth of Carlo Gambino being passed down like a story told late at night in smoky backrooms. Younger soldiers hear the tales from older men, how Carlo could settle disputes with a few quiet words, how he kept the peace between the 5 families, how he never let his temper or his pride cost him what he had built. These stories grow with time, polishing his image until he is less a man and more a symbol of what the mafia could be when run with intelligence instead of brute force. Outside the underworld, Gambino's name became part of American cultural memory. Books, documentaries, and television series referenced him, often painting him as the quintessential godfather figure, the calm, calculating patriarch who preferred diplomacy over violence. He became the quiet counterpoint to the flamboyant gangsters of popular imagination, a reminder that the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who says the least. Even academics studying organized crime point to the Gambino model of leadership as a case study in long-term criminal success. He managed to grow his family into the most powerful of the 5 without sparking wars that could destroy it. He kept law enforcement chasing shadows. He left behind an organization that did not collapse the moment he was gone. Of course, not all of his legacy is romantic. Gambino was still a man who profited from extortion, gambling, and racketeering, whose decisions sometimes meant life or death for others. His calmness did not make him gentle. When violence was necessary, he sanctioned it without hesitation. But this, too, was part of his myth, that his violence was measured, never reckless, never wasteful. In this way, Gambino came to represent something almost paradoxical, a criminal king who seemed to embody order rather than chaos. While other bosses burned hot and fast, leaving trails of blood and headlines, Gambino ruled like a slow, steady flame, one that warmed rather than consumed, one that lasted longer than anyone expected. Picture him as history remembers him, a quiet man with sharp eyes, sitting at the head of a table, hands folded, listening more than speaking. Around him, the room is tense, waiting for his verdict. When he finally speaks, his words are simple, decisive, final. This is the image that lingers, not a man shouting or waving his arms, but a man whose calm voice could move an entire empire. His legacy also lives on in the very name of the family he once led. The Gambino crime family, still one of the most famous in the world, carries his name decades after his death. Every headline, every investigation into the family still echoes the memory of the man who made it the most powerful of them all. His ghost seems to hover over its history, as though reminding each new generation of bosses of the standard they are expected to live up to. Even in popular imagination, the phrase "the quiet dawn" carries a certain reverence. It is a reminder that power does not need to roar to be absolute. In an age where loudness is often mistaken for strength, Carlo Gambino's life offers a different lesson, that the greatest victories are often the ones no one sees coming, and the most enduring leaders are the ones who do not need applause. As this chapter draws to a close, Imagine the streets of Brooklyn at night, decades after Gambino's passing. The docks are quieter now, the world changed, but somewhere in the air, there is still a whisper of what once was. The man who ruled from the shadows may be gone, but the shadow he cast is still there, stretching across time, a reminder of a man who mastered patience, power, and silence. The story of Carlo Gambino is, in the end, not just the story of a mafia boss, it is the story of a man who learned to bend the world to his will without ever shouting, a man who turned silence into power and patience into an empire. As we reach the close of this journey, it is worth pausing to reflect on what his life truly meant not only for organized crime, but as a study in human ambition, discipline, and the art of subtlety. Carlo Gambino was not the most violent boss, nor the most feared. He was not the flashiest, nor the richest in terms of public display. And yet, he is remembered as one of the most successful, perhaps the most successful, mafia leaders in American history. His power was not measured by the number of bodies left in his wake but by the decades he managed to stay at the top without falling. In a world where bosses often burned bright and then burned out, Gambino endured. His life teaches that real strength does not always come from loudness or force. It comes from knowing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. Gambino's greatest victories were not the ones splashed across newspapers, but the ones no one even knew had happened, the quiet deals that kept the peace, the subtle maneuvers that removed enemies without a war, the decisions that allowed his family to keep growing stronger while others tore themselves apart. Imagine the lesson in that for a moment, that patience can be more powerful than rage, that calmness can command more respect than shouting ever could. Carlo Gambino understood something fundamental about human nature, that men follow those they trust, that respect lasts longer than fear, and that empires built on chaos eventually collapse. He also teaches that power carries responsibility. Gambino did not use his position recklessly. He did not seek fame, did not court headlines, did not expose his family to danger for the sake of ego. For all his crimes, and there were many, he brought a kind of order to a world that might otherwise have descended into endless bloodshed. He was, in his way, a stabilizer, a man who turned a loose network of gangs into a disciplined, profitable syndicate. There is, too, a strange kind of poetry in the way his story ends. Most mob bosses meet violent deaths or die in prison cells, their power stripped from them long before their final breath. Gambino, by contrast, lived long enough to see his grandchildren, to sit at his own dinner table night after night, to die in his favorite chair in his own home. He left behind not chaos, but a carefully prepared succession plan, ensuring that his family and organization would not be thrown into war the moment he was gone. Picture, for a moment, the city at night as our story closes. The lights of Manhattan glow in the distance, the rivers reflect the moon, the hum of traffic is softer now. Somewhere in Brooklyn, the house on Ocean Parkway still stands, quite ordinary to those who pass by. But if you pause there, if you listen closely, you can almost feel the weight of history in its walls, the presence of the man who once shaped the destiny of New York's underworld from its rooms. Carlo Gambino's life can be seen as a parable about control, control over others, yes, but most of all control over oneself. He did not let anger make his decisions for him. He did not let greed push him into reckless ventures. He did not let fear paralyze him when danger was near. He stayed steady, even when the world around him was in flames, and that steadiness allowed him to outlast them all. And perhaps that is why, even now, his story continues to fascinate. It is not just a tale of crime and power, it is a meditation on the idea that sometimes the most enduring impact comes from the quietest presence. The world remembers John Gotti as the Teflon Don, a man who basked in the spotlight and paid the price. But Carlo Gambino is remembered as something different, a whisper that lasted longer than any shout, a shadow that outlived the noise. As you settle into the stillness of this moment, perhaps there is a lesson to take with you that calm is a kind of strength, that patience can shape the future, and that silence, when used wisely, can speak louder than words. Carlo Gambino's empire may have been built on crime, but the principles that guided him, discipline, caution, foresight, are universal. They remind us that life is not always about the boldest move but often about the most carefully timed one. And so, as our story ends, the quiet dawn fades back into the shadows where he always preferred to be. The streets are calm again, the night air cool and still. Somewhere, the distant sound of a ship horn echoes across the harbor, and the city settles under its blanket of lights. Carlo Gambino's life is complete, a life that began in a small Sicilian village, crossed an ocean, survived wars and betrayals, and ended peacefully, leaving behind a legend. Close your eyes and let the city fade from view. Imagine the quiet that follows when the last piece of a long story falls into place. The quiet dawn is gone, but the lessons remain. Patience. Silence. Control. These are the things that endure, long after the man himself has vanished. The empire he built may rise and fall, but the myth of Carlo Gambino, the man who ruled from the shadows, will always whisper through history.